Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone. So Jana, thank you so much for joining me on the No Show podcast. I'm really pleased to have you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So you have a very interesting area of research. And before we get into it, in summary, it's about sort of Sumerian history and culture. What led you to have that interest in it?
That's a good question. I think I was always interested in ancient things, and I did look a bit around. I didn't really know anything about the ancient Near East. I knew a bit about Egypt, but that was it. And then I realized, okay, well, lots and lots of things were actually invented in Mesopotamia, which is roughly modern day Iraq. And I think what attracted me to it was that I didn't know anything about it. So I realized you can study this at university level. I did it together with a bit of archaeology. Actually, what came first was my general interest in archaeology. But the ancient Near East was kind of mysterious and not too far away at the same time. So I realized that actually many things that we take for granted come from the ancient Near East. So we're kind of culturally connected to it. And at the same time, it doesn't really get a lot of recognition. So certainly at school, I didn't learn anything about it. And it seemed to me that there was an important gap in my knowledge, which I tried to fill.
That's very interesting. And it's also very interesting that you sort of chose a very unique bit of Sumerian history to sort of focus your research on.
That's true. While I was studying, I was interested in all sorts of different things, but I studied mainly with a professor in Germany, actually, whose main interest was Sumerian literature. So he passed on that interest to me because I took many classes with him. And what attracted me particularly about Sumerian literature was the feeling that there are still so many completely new texts to be discovered. And that's something which I always found, well, I hope nobody from classics is listening, but you know, everyone's read Homer, and it's so difficult to find a completely new perspective on things that have been written on before. And here we have cuneiform tablets both waiting in various museums, but also still in the ground in Iraq. And they offer completely new things. So I was always interested in literature in general, but the prospect of finding completely unknown texts was definitely very thrilling.
Well, I mean, the text that you sort of did focus your PhD on is fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating to me in many ways, but could you sort of, for those who are tuning into the episode now, could you give them a very sort of brief summary of what the text was?
Yes, so it is a verbal duel between two women who are neighbors in one of the many cities of southern Mesopotamia, which is now roughly the area south of Baghdad in modern day Iraq. And they didn't get on very well. We have to imagine these people living very close to one another. From what we can tell from archaeological excavations of residential areas in cities from the early 2nd millennium BCE is that it was really quite tight. So you can imagine people living too close to one another, that leads to conflict. And these two women in particular, they decided to engage in something that's a bit like a modern rap battle about who's the better woman. So they engage in this pretty formal sort of conflict, and they exchange speeches of several lines of text. And then they indicate, okay, I've made my point, now it's your turn. So they're really these, it's everyone gets 10 speeches each, and they follow a certain pattern. But the problem is there is this one woman who is very jealous of her rival because her rival is very fertile and has lots of children, which she does not have. And that seems to be the underlying conflict between the two women. And from the perspective of what is a good woman or what is a good wife, it's clearly the one who bears lots of children. So she is at a natural disadvantage, and she seems to compensate that, well, very sad problem that she seems to have by being particularly vicious in this rhetorical contest. And at the very end, she seems to realize, okay, she's not doing so well. Her opponent is much better rhetorically and strategically. And then she just flips out and calls her rival a whore in very, stark images. And that's overstepping the rules of in kind of playfully engaging in such a context. You can call your rival pretty much anything, but you must not, under any circumstances, call a married woman a whore, because that, of course, implies adultery. Yeah. And as pretty much anywhere in the ancient world, adultery is a capital offense. Women can be killed for that. So, of course, the slandered woman, apparently she's really innocent. She didn't commit adultery. She's outraged. And what's worse is that somehow, possibly because they were witnesses to this fight, word gets around, and the slandered woman's husband hears about this. He realizes that his wife has been accused of adultery, and he immediately demands a divorce. And the poor woman tries to defend herself, and the only thing she feels she can do in order to prevent that from happening is appeal to the king. I mean, this is probably not how it was in real life, but in the context of a kind of story, it's of course much more fun if the king personally gets involved in this fight between neighbors. And then there are lots of twists and turns. The text is a bit badly preserved at this point, but finally, the slandering woman is legally convicted. She gets lashes on her back and her buttocks, and half her hair shorn off, and her lips rubbed with salt, which is a beautiful mirror punishing, because it's her lip and her mouth that are the criminal body part. And that's the end of the story. It's quite a complex text that all kind of leads towards that end, because slandering is an aspect that gets mentioned very early on. And it was composed as a kind of didactic text, which could teach students lots of things. It was really composed by school teachers for their pupils, which were predominantly boys. It could teach them the characteristics of an ideal woman, of an ideal future wife. They were probably teenagers when they studied this text at school, so just about preparing themselves mentally for choosing a wife. And also there's this whole aspect of rhetorics, how to fight with words, how to build a convincing argument, and how to comport yourself in such a kind of situation, in such a heated quarrel, where it's very important not to freak out and not to lose your temper, because then you might say things which you later regret. So it's very much also a lesson in rhetoric, how to build an argument and how to stick to a certain rhetorical strategy.
So essentially, it was also it was somewhat of like a lesson in wisdom kind of thing.
Absolutely, very much so, yeah.
Is there any records of who the author might have been of these tablets?
Unfortunately not. We hardly ever have authors mentioned for texts from the early second millennium BCE. It's relatively obvious that they must have been scribes themselves, or possibly school teachers, because the text was studied as part of the scribal curriculum. I think I should perhaps at this point mention that scribal education goes through several different stages, but what's most important, so first of all, the cuneiform writing system is quite complex. It's a bit like Chinese, you have hundreds of signs and they can have different readings. So it takes several years to really become fluent in that writing system. It's not an alphabet, so it's more complex than that, and it takes time to kind of come to grips with that. The other thing is, these schoolboys at that time, they were speaking Babylonian, most of them, which is a Semitic language, so related to Arabic, for example, Hebrew, whatever. And they had to learn, in order to learn the cuneiform writing system, they had to learn Sumerian, which is an isolated language and completely unrelated to their own mother tongue. So that's quite a challenge for anyone if it's a language so different from their own. And in the more advanced stages of the scribal curriculum, they would actually kind of read the classics. Yeah, that's the equivalent. They would read texts in Sumerian, which, were probably as difficult for them to understand as if we're now trying to read, classical Arabic or something.
There wasn't any kind of like relationship between the two languages.
No, not at all. There was quite a lot of language contact, because Sumerians and Babylonians lived side by side for centuries. But typologically, the languages are very different, and it's clear from the kind of tablets written by schoolboys that they sometimes struggled with the grammar because it was so unlike their own language. So it was really only for the very advanced ones to study these literary texts. For most students, it was enough to just learn the writing system and then write, some letters, some contracts, some everyday documents. They wouldn't necessarily go on to study Sumerian literature. But those who did, they could read these sort of texts, and I'm sure they enjoyed them as much as we did.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds incredibly interesting. What's most striking to me is the concept of it being a verbal duel, and it's of two women. Now, the reason why I find it so interesting is because I'm from Iraq originally, and in the south of Iraq, where I'm from, there's a type of poetry that is attributed, and it's a type of feminist poetry, might I add. So the sort of founders of this style of poem were women, and it is attributed to a Sumerian type of poetry, widely attributed amongst Iraqi researchers, and it's also dual in nature, like a verbal dual in nature. So I find it really interesting that it's just something that's sort of passed its way down, even though it's in a different language and it's in a slightly different form. It somehow managed to find its way to modern day Iraq.
That is indeed fascinating. What I didn't know about this particular type of duel between women, I'd actually love to hear more about it. What I did know was that generally the kind of genre of literary disputations or literary verbal contests, that is very old, and there are even older examples of that sort of literature than the text I've been working on. But they tend to be not between human protagonists, more between abstract concepts, reasons, animals, precious metals, and this is definitely a form of entertaining literature that has been very popular throughout the ages. And I read that, so there is one disputation between summer and winter,
Okay,
attested
yeah.
from the early 2nd millennium BCE, but possibly being a lot older than that. And you have a slightly more modern Iraqi Arabic version of
Yeah.
the same debate.
Yeah.
So even the topics have quite a remarkable degree of longevity. I think the genre really has its origins in, you know, kind of improvised verbal duel. Rather than first being literary texts, I could imagine that these were live performances of someone impersonating winter and someone impersonating summer, and them coming up in a kind of live setting with why winter should be more important than summer. And then only later this gets kind of transferred into a written form, and then it's always winter winning. But well, we have unfortunately hardly any evidence for the kind of live improvised performative context. We only have the written evidence from ancient Iraq, but I could imagine that this was going on side by side. You know, there was the kind of canonized written form, but I could well imagine that there was a more popular version of it in the kind of vernacular of the time that kept entertaining people.
It's very interesting, and it's really unfortunate that there's no evidence to suggest, like, or no clear evidence to say with conviction that this was performed. Because in my mind, it does seem very performative in nature, just the concept of it being a duel.
Definitely, definitely. I've actually looked at this question. So what we have from the late 3rd millennium, from the 21st century BCE, is evidence for the performance of what is called ada min in Sumerian. Ada means contest and min means two. So it's literally a contest between two antagonists. And this is also the term used in these later literary duels. So it's quite possible that these contests between, bird and fish, or summer and winter, were performed at the royal court in the 21st century BCE. And then later we have the texts written down. Whether they're exactly the same as the ones that might have entertained the king a few hundred years earlier, we cannot know for certain. But we do have external evidence for the performance of some sort of contest between two in the late 3rd millennium BCE. There's also some text internal evidence for the performance. So first of all, it really reads like a theatre play without stage instructions, because there are no narrative parts whatsoever. It's just direct speech, which makes it very, very lively. But what's interesting is that the two protagonists who are mainly speaking, they very rarely address one another. It's more like they're talking to an audience.
Oh yes, yeah.
So generally all these disputations or verbal duels, they have like a tripartite structure with an introductory scene in which they kind of initiate the quarrel, and then in the main part they have this more formalized quarrel obeying certain rules, and then there is the resolution of the conflict in the end. And in the first and in the last part, they have a more natural dialogue because they're kind of really interacting with one another. In the main part, they hardly talk to each other at all. So rather than saying to their opponent, "You're doing this and that wrong, you're so incompetent, look at you, you can't even do the most basic tasks of a housewife," they say, "Look at her, she's doing it all wrong. She can't do that. She's such an idiot." And there are a couple of other asides to the audience, even in parts that have a more natural dialogue. So I really believe that I kind of imagine, I don't really have any external proof for this, but I like to imagine that these two women are on a stage and they're both facing the audience and they're talking about what their opponent is doing wrong. And they're trying to curry favor with the audience. They try to seem more competent by pointing out their adversaries' mistakes. And in the end, the audience is invited to judge who's doing.
Okay. So it does read like it is presented to someone of authority.
Definitely. So I think maybe it's also useful to know that I believe there are really two different subcategories within this larger corpus of literary debates in Sumerian. There are the traditional ones between characters like bird and fish, copper and silver, date palm and tamarisk, summer and winter. So normally inarticulate entities that are personified, they can suddenly speak and engage in a contest with one another. And then it's either a king or a deity who decides who's more important. But what's really important to bear in mind is that they're very playful and there is not that much at stake, because in the end, everyone will agree that you need summer and winter for a seasonal cycle. Both a hoe and a plow are useful tools. Both birds and fish, you could come up, I mean, in the Sumerian text, the bird wins, but you could equally imagine a scenario in which the fish wins, because there is no really good reason for why a bird should be more important than a fish.
Well, I think, I mean, the ones that I've witnessed in Iraqi culture that borrow these exact same concepts. I've witnessed one between water and fire. And,
great.
Yeah, and it's always it's in. I guess like the most important thing that I took from it was more of a challenge between the poets and their linguistic ability as opposed to like who wins.
Absolutely. It's a rhetorical contest and it's about who can come up with the better reasons.
Yeah.
Even though in the end, everyone will acknowledge that both are equally worthy. I know another one between tea and coffee, which is also really nice, from Bahrain, I think. That's very different so I think this is the traditional genre, which possibly was already very, active and lively in the 3rd millennium BCE. In the early 2nd millennium BCE, in this context where schoolboys have to learn an ancient language, which is Sumerian, and kind of grapple with that, and need also not some linguistic instructions, also some moral instruction of how to become a good member of society. It was the school teachers who came up with an adaptation of that kind of genre of verbal duels in which they feature human protagonists. So they tried to make it more directly relatable, and most of these contests between human protagonists, they're actually schoolboys, scribal apprentices at school. So exactly the protagonists are the same, in the same situation as the people studying these texts. So they were really written for them, so they could directly relate to them. But there's a really big difference, because they debate about who's better at, given school disciplines.
Okay.
But they're peers. It's not a scribe against a farmer.
Yeah.
And they say, well, who is more important for society? Is it the scribe or is it the farmer? It's two members of the same profession or aspiring to practice the same profession. And there's one incompetent and one competent one. And then you have a completely different outcome, right? Even if, say, the bird is better rhetorically than the fish, in the end, everyone will say, okay, well, the kind of one, the fish wasn't as good a speaker, but that doesn't mean we kind of get rid of fish altogether. They still are very useful. We can eat them, etc. With an incompetent scribe, you could say, we don't need them. They're completely useless. There is no real benefit to society. And the same with housewives. There's one very competent housewife and one very incompetent. And there's a very harsh decision being made in the end. There is hardly room for reconciliation or saying, well, you may be better in a rhetorical context test, but you have other qualities. Here we really have a choice between success and failure. And that kind of displays the kind of didactic background of these texts, where they really try to motivate students to outperform their peers and be very diligent and be a good schoolboy, because if not, you'll be the complete laughing stock of the entire academy.
So the stakes are high.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's fascinating. I think one of the things that I understood from your work, that to me is really like it speaks to how much effort has gone into, is just the difficulty in getting the sources and the materials.
Indeed, they're not all of them easily available. I'm always happy when I find photographs on certain online databases. That helps. But if not, there's hardly any way of knowing where they might be hidden, because many museums and other collections don't have a complete catalogue of what they have in their collections. And without such catalogues being available, how would you know what lies in a drawer somewhere? Then it's really a matter of chance. I was, by sheer coincidence, able to identify a few new manuscripts of the text, but I'm sure I haven't found all of them, because I wouldn't even know where to start looking. There is, for instance, one single tablet in the Louvre in Paris and one single tablet in Berlin, a handful, like a dozen tablets in the British Museum, and then elsewhere quite a number in Istanbul. But I only knew of these tablets because they were already published in a kind of black and white drawing. What else might be hiding in cupboards in all of these institutions, I have no way of knowing. And they don't really, at least nowadays, allow people to come and say, can I please have a look at everything and see if I can find some more? So it is rather difficult to find new manuscripts unless there is some sort of record of them somewhere.
So is there no sort of demand by academics, or sort of a body of academics to say we need to archive this stuff? Like we need to be able to study it.
There is. The problem is museums are quite often understaffed as well. And it is not easy to read cuneiform. As I said, you have to know hundreds of signs, and signs have multiple different readings depending on context. And we also have over 3,000 years of cuneiform writing, in which, the shape changes, and we've got several different languages written in that writing system. So it is not easy to just, look at a tablet and immediately identify its contents. Quite often they're also badly broken. And most museums don't have the capacity to do that sort of work. What I should say, though, what's been extremely useful in my research is what's called the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, CDLI, which aims at putting information on cuneiform tablets online. So what you find there, if you're lucky, is a photograph and some basic information on the tablet, for example, the publication or what text it contains, at least in which language it was written, a rough dating and what sort of genre. Is it legal? Is it administrative? Is it literary? And they've sent people to many collections, and they have scanned these tablets essentially. But not every collection wants to collaborate with them. Some institutions are quite protective of what they have in their cupboards. So many North American collections have been almost completely scanned. That's very useful, but elsewhere we don't really know how many tablets they have and what sort of tablets they're housing in their collection.
And what about new tablets that are uncovered? Is there do they get sort of go straight into this backlog of museum dump, or do they sort of do they get like highlighted?
Yes, so well, right now several teams are working again in Iraq. When I started studying, there wasn't that much archaeological work being carried out in Iraq due to the political situation, but this has really changed, and Iraqi colleagues are extremely active in the field. So both, well, the one big problem that we have and still have is looting, but they have had quite some success in recent years at seizing and confiscating looted tablets. They then go straight to either a local museum or the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. Same goes with regular excavations. And lots of people are actually very, very busy trying to publish these newly excavated tablets. But it takes time. It's really very time consuming because they're difficult to decipher and you just can't read them as fast as you could read an alphabetic script.
Well, one of the things you sort of mentioned, and you just referred to slightly again, is the fact that these tablets are in 3D format, and given that they're in 3D format, and then they have to be sort of scanned or take a picture taken of them for you then as a researcher to like read and go through. Can this lead to like a loss in translation?
Definitely. So what you need to do if you're either photographing a cuneiform tablet or scanning it is you need to approach it from lots of different angles. What they're doing at CDLI is they have a dome where they're taking multiple scans simultaneously. And ideally, I mean, this is now the new trend, you're trying to capture the 3D format of the tablet. So you can, with the respective software, you can turn it around on your screen, which is terribly useful. If you don't have that kind of technology, you can take several different shots with the camera and piece them together. So you can see the obverse and the left edge and whatever different parts of the tablets. But I've found that it is actually very difficult even sometimes because the surface is hardly ever even and it kind of disappears towards the edge, etc. It's very difficult to photograph tablets in the first place. And you really need to rely on this being done extremely professionally if you want to be able to read a tablet just from the photo. So in my experience, you almost always have to go and see the original to figure it out entirely. And obviously, that's not always possible. There's a financial aspect to it. There is a logistic aspect to it. Sometimes we just don't have the opportunity to travel around all the time like I did. I mean, luckily I had funding from a scholarship. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to do that. But there definitely gets lots of things get lost in translation, particularly with this sort of genre, which seems to be very close to colloquial Sumerian, for which we otherwise have no record whatsoever. I mean, normally what gets written down is very standardized. You only rarely get glimpses of dialects because, of course, language changes over time and people spoke different dialects of Sumerian in different parts of the country. But we mainly have the kind of official record, which is very streamlined. It's the kind of king's Sumerian or the queen's Sumerian. And what we have in these verbal duels is lots of insults and swear words and slang and proverbs being quoted. And sometimes we can more or less intuitively understand what a certain metaphor might be referring to. And sometimes we can produce a translation, but we cannot really know the implications of a certain statement. Because it's so, culturally contingent, and we're removed both in time and space by 4,000 years and equal amounts of kilometers. It's very difficult. So sometimes I can produce a translation, but I have no idea what it's supposed to mean.
That's really interesting. And so the details of your research you've compiled into a book.
That's true. So I have written one big book on this one single text, which contains both the kind of critical edition in which I justify my translation and the translation, and also very detailed analysis of the text. So I've tried to write it in a way that the first part, which contains the analysis, is accessible to non-specialists. I might not always have succeeded, but that was my goal, to make it accessible to people who don't have a background in ancient Near Eastern studies, because I do believe this text can be of interest to people in other fields, such as, literary studies, but also people interested in ancient forms of pedagogy, gender studies, legal history. The text is so rich that it kind of really offers things for many different people. And then there's the very kind of technical part, which deals with the Sumerian language, which I know even my colleagues probably won't read.
What's the book called?
The book, well, the book is in German, I'm afraid. So it's got a German title. I don't expect anyone to read it. I must say, in my defense, though, that it's still quite common in ancient Near Eastern studies that people publish in the three conference languages, which is English, French, and German. And all the recent work on Sumerian literary disputations has actually been published in German, because German research is working on that.
Oh, that's really interesting. I had no idea.
Yes, there is a kind of groundbreaking study on these traditional Sumerian contests between summer and winter, bird and fish, etc. by Katrin Mittermeier from the University of Geneva, whose work is published in German. And then there's my book, and there is a couple of others forthcoming, which will also be in German, unfortunately. And I'm aware of the difficulties this poses. So what I was trying to do...
honestly, I wouldn't. We do have quite a decent sized following from Germany, so
Anyway, what I was trying to do is summarize the most important, or address the most important aspects in English publications as well. So I've got one paper on the role of women's work in society, which is in English, and another paper on the kind of rhetorical aspects and rhetorical and stylistic aspects of the text, which I've mentioned earlier, to show that it was really quite a complex text, which functions according to the usual rules for ritual insulting in these texts. And eventually my English translation of the text will be freely accessible on the internet. So my book just came out 2 weeks ago,
Oh, okay, so it's just,
and the publishing house, De Gruyter, imposed a 1-year embargo because they first want to sell a couple of copies before I can make things freely available on the internet. But eventually, the English translation will be freely accessible for anyone. So I tried to kind of buffer the fact that the big book is in German by providing some additional English publications.
I know, that's amazing. I think that's really
on the
interesting.
internet.
Just broadening the work to a sort of wider audience, whether it's German or English, it is something that we sort of want to be a part of and help sort of academics to spread knowledge of the research that they've been doing, because it's incredibly important. And you know, just speaking to you, I can tell the level of depth and detail you had to go into to sort of get to a real sound understanding of it. Where can people find you online?
I've got an academia.edu page where I upload publications if I'm allowed to. So that's always a bit of an issue with the publisher. My most up-to-date list of publications will always be on my university webpage. So right now I'm lecturer in Ancient Near Eastern Studies at SOAS. I also have a Twitter account, which I sometimes use, but for Ancient Near Eastern things. So I think these would be the 3 ways to find my work online.
Yeah, if you send me those links, I'll make sure they're on the podcast so people can get direct access to them.
I will, thank you.
Jana, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. I've really enjoyed speaking to you, and I personally find this to be incredibly insightful into what Sumerian culture was, and so thank you for taking the time to speak to me.
Thank you very much. It was really great fun.
Thank you for watching this video. Please help us keep the show alive by liking and sharing this video, and by subscribing to the show and making sure the notification button is switched on. For those of you who can help a little bit more, there's a Patreon link down below where you can contribute whatever you can. Every little does help, and all the money will go directly back into the show. You can also keep up with our latest content on Instagram at The No Show Pod, as you can see on the screen. As you know, The No Show is an initiative designed to make academic research accessible to everyone. So do contribute to the conversation, leave some questions, have a discussion, and I'll make sure I get back to everyone.